Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to the first academic session of Game Plan. This series is something that we have been excited to bring to you every month, and we have a special guest speaker, Dr. Brian Hainline, the Chief Medical Officer at the NCAA. So we're about to get started. The first session will be Dr. Hainline and Dr. Miller, our Director of the SWAG Initiative. They will have an open discussion. It will be free flowing, and then part two will consist of Q&A. So please, if you can't hold their Q&As till towards the end of the session, but if you want to post them now, we will get to all of the Q&A sessions at the end. So with that being said, I would like to introduce Dr. Miller and Dr. Hainline.
Thank you, Anthony. And welcome to everyone to our first game plan series of the academic year. We trust that you all had a good summer and that your academic year is off to a good start. For those of you who are new to the game plan series, this is something we instituted a couple of years ago in association with our SWAG initiative. And SWAG stands for Scholar Athletes with Academic Goals. And the idea here is that we are started an initiative to attract student athletes, we call them scholar athletes, into health careers in the sciences, with the understanding that those same skills, those soft skills that you learn as an athlete that are kind of hardwired to an athlete, are the same skills that are essential for success in these careers. The goal of the initiative is one, to educate scholar athletes and their supporters, mentors, parents, coaches, that these careers are a perfect fit for student athletes, as well as to help those athletes who have self-identified, who are interested in these careers, to help them navigate the academic process. So to enhance the SWAG initiative, we started a game plan series. Understanding that to be successful in athletics and sport, you need a game plan. And to be successful in life and to navigate these careers successfully, you need a game plan that's equally successful. So that's what the game plan series is all about. We invite individuals who were former or current athletes who have transitioned to other careers. And the idea is to talk to them, see how they actually were able to navigate the academic or professional pathways, and how athletics was useful and beneficial to them during that navigation. As Anthony said, the first part of the series of the session is going to be just a free-flowing conversation. And we'll ask you to post your questions in the Q&A feature. And we will have an open, interactive part two of the session, about 20 to 30 minutes in. I am extremely happy to invite or to welcome Dr. Brian Hainline to be our first speaker to kick off the game plan series for this year. Dr. Hainline is the Chief Medical Officer for the NCAA, National Collegiate Athletic Association, and Senior Vice President for the Sport Science Institute. He oversees the Sport Science Institute, a general center of excellence, a national center of excellence, whose mission is to promote and develop safety, excellence, and wellness in college student athletes, and foster lifetime physical and mental development. The NCAA Sport Science Institute also collaborates with the Department of Defense on the NCAA-DoD Grand Alliance, the largest and most comprehensive concussion injury study in history. And we'll talk about that as we go along. For over 30 years, Dr. Hainline has been actively involved in sports medicine, including serving as the Chief Medical Officer of the U.S. Open Tennis Championships and the United States Tennis Association. As New Yorkers, you know a little bit about the U.S. Open. He is also a co-author of Drugs and the Athlete, and played a pivotal role in the rollout of drug testing and education worldwide regarding athletics. He has also co-edited the recently published medical book, Sports Neurology, which provides an in-depth academic overview of concussion and repetitive head injury exposure and the nervous system and sport interplay. He has served as co-chair of two International Olympic Committee consensus meetings, one on pain management in elite athletes and mental health in elite athletes, leading to a consensus and subspecialty publication. Academically, Dr. Hainline is a clinical professor of neurology at NYU School of Medicine and Indiana University School of Medicine. On a personal note, Dr. Hainline has been one of our strongest supporters of the SWAG initiative, Scholar Athletes with Academic Goals. He has authored and talked widely about the involvement of athletes in sport, and has authored an interesting paper that you all should try and get your hands on. I think Anthony can send out in the chat, is in asking the question, do athletes make good doctors? He works closely with the NIH, National Institutes of Health, in the Office of Biomedical Workforce Diversity, and the Association of American Medical College on various diversity initiatives in the context of increasing representation from underserved groups in academic medicine and the sciences. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hainline to the Game Plan series. So Dr. Hainline, let's start by talking about your involvement in athletics. You can go back starting when you were a youngster, and then we'll transition to your involvement in athletics at the collegiate level.
Well, thanks, Dr. Miller, and or maybe we call ourselves Reg and Brian, but
that works.
we know each other well. And first of all, it's really a pleasure to be in the Game Plan series, and it's really been an honor to be part of SWAG, and I appreciate that. So I grew up in Detroit and played multiple sports like a lot of people my age. I mean, we just, after school, we would find a park and we'd play football and baseball and run and jump and wrestle and do whatever. But I discovered tennis at a relatively young age as well. And I come from a family of tennis players. And what we would do in Detroit, I mean, in the public parks, that's how we spent our summer when we weren't doing other sorts of things. We'd go to the court and just find, an open tennis court and train. And in the wintertime, we actually played on wood basketball courts. We'd set up a net and or hit up against the wall. Or if it wasn't too cold, we'd shovel a court and actually take a sock and cut the toe off the sock and put it over the racket handle and put our hand inside. And that's what we did. And until it was my freshman year of high school, the tennis boom hit the country in Detroit. And so there were a group of us, we worked out a deal with these club owners, and we would wake up at 4:30 and get to their club. We'd clean the club, and then they'd let us play on the courts for an hour and a half before school started. So that's kind of, as time moved on, I realized I was actually decent at tennis and that I might have a shot at playing in college. And so it was really just finding a core group of parents and kids my age and really like a support system that took us out of places we didn't necessarily need to be in or want to be in or shouldn't have been in. And it provided an incredible opportunity for me to mature as a boy and as an adolescent. And ultimately it provided a pathway into college for me.
So what was it about tennis as opposed to basketball, baseball? What was it about tennis that kind of drew you to that sport?
Well, in part, I had a family history and of my brother was a top-ranked player in the country, and my father actually was a Hall of Famer and at his college in Illinois. So there was that. But I think I became particularly attracted to tennis as an individual sport. You're out there problem solving on your own. You couldn't even have coaching during matches and just being able to travel. There were so many different tennis tournaments, and we had parents that would take us all over the Midwest at the time. And so there was just so many opportunities, believe it or not. I mean, we often think of tennis as being this sort of, rich kids, white kids, country club sport. But where I was, I mean, we were, my best friends were, I was raised as a sort of a strict Catholic, but my best friends were Protestants and blacks and Jews and whoever showed up at the public courts, and and we just fed off each other. So it was a unique circumstance that was very different than the country club scene.
So you played tennis in high school, and so it did ultimately lead to a collegiate experience.
Yeah, it did. So I ended up playing at Notre Dame, and was a scholarship athlete, and so it was a great experience. You know, at Notre Dame, you know, people say, well, what do you do on the weekends at Notre Dame? And you know, you either study, or in the fall you go to football games, and or you go to parties and you drink. And you know, not to say that those aren't the only thing, but that was kind of the choices. But what we did as athletes, I mean, we traveled on the weekend, and we ended up getting to go to a lot of places in the country I had never seen before. Went out to California, went to Texas, did road trips in the Southeast in the springtime so we could compete. And it really ended up being just a way of being. I became very close to my teammates. They were like a support system for me. And you learned in college to be incredibly disciplined, because there's just no way you could train 3 or 4 hours a day and still do your studies. And so what you gave up sometimes was the partying on the weekend, but you still had time to socialize. And what you gained was a sense of discipline and commitment that really I've had ever since then, that really has pulled me through my career and the whole way I navigate life.
So what did you major in undergrad?
So Notre Dame had this interesting program. It was called pre-professional. So you actually double majored. So I had a major in philosophy, and my second major was pre-med. So I took all of the core requirements from pre-med, but I also got to sort of be outside of that. And you know, the philosophy, it just was the first time in my life where I was just reading, you know, from all of these great minds, and it really has a deep imprint on me today, just sort of, you know, trying to get to, like, you know, what is life all about and what is the meaning of life? So that, combined with science, which kind of came easy to me, it was really a wonderful way to go through school.
So one of the challenges that we've encountered with some of our SWAG participants is a challenge of navigating athletics and academics on two fronts. One, the rigors associated with training and practice, and being taken seriously as an athlete with regard to academic pursuits. Can you talk about whether you have personally experienced anything like that, or whether you have any teammates or friends who had that type of experience in college in particular?
No, it's really an issue. I'll talk about one issue. When I was visiting Princeton, and you know, there are a lot of scholar athletes there, and met with the athletes, and so many of them told me that they're not taken seriously, that people look at them and say, well, you just got into Princeton because you're an athlete, not because you're smart. And I think there's this sort of mentality, you know, there's almost a derogatory term where the athletes are called jocks or something similar to that, and so they can't be intellects. You know, personally, during my sophomore year, my second year of college, and that's when we take organic chemistry lab. And that's when I first started really struggling with the balance, because lab was every afternoon from 1 till 5, and we had to be at tennis practice at 3:30. And I remember going to my lab professor and saying, you know, is there a way I can do lab at a different time? I really can't miss tennis practice. I can't miss meets. And he looked at me and said, you know, we aren't going to make any exceptions for you. So if you don't want to do it, you aren't going to pass organic chemistry lab. So then I went to my tennis coach and said, look, you know, I need to have an exception, and, you know, because of organic lab and so forth. And he said, look, you want an exception, just leave the team. You're going to lose your scholarship. So it's the first time it really hit me very hard. And so what I ended up doing was, you know, I met with the provost, and I met with the coach. I met with the director of athletics. I said, you know, there has to be a way for us to be able to do both. And so they allowed me to, you know, work out a kind of a condensed schedule, if you will. I would use the buddy system for people to take notes. And you know, many of my professors were very open to others taking notes for me, and then I would catch up. So, you know what, it was hard because you had to navigate on your own. You had to push for yourself. But on the other hand, it taught me a discipline that I don't think I had before. And once you get that discipline inside of you, and it's a discipline not just of time management, but really energy management, how you eat, how you sleep, how you take care of yourself. And so it was hard. I will say, Reg, my second year was really tough. But once I figured out how to navigate it and I found some advocates on my behalf, I didn't give up. I kept pushing. That was probably the springboard for the rest of my life.
And so you entered college as a pre-med. You had those aspirations going into college?
Well, I wasn't sure. That's why I did the double major. I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a philosophy professor or go into medicine. No one in my family had gone into medicine. But it was actually my junior year. I did a special 1-year study on a psychiatrist named Carl Jung, not a very mainstream psychiatrist. He was kind of out there, with the collective unconsciousness and things like that. But I became just so engrossed in that and said, I want to go to med school and be a psychiatrist. And so that was really what convinced me more than anything else that I wanted to do medicine. As it turned out, I became a neurologist. But that was the impetus. The other thing, between philosophy and medicine, more and more, I just said, how can I really make an impact in the world? And the idea of really working with other human beings and helping them as they're struggling, that started to make more and more sense to me as well. So I wasn't exactly certain going in. I was, hedging my bets by doing a double major, but by my third year, I was absolutely convinced I wanted to be a physician.
So you're a double major, you're playing sports, and you're pre-med on top of that. So you're busting all the myths that this is a difficult path.
Again, I think what's really important in this, Reg, and this is what we taught our children is, first of all, you have to be an advocate for yourself, and you surround yourself by people who love you and who are going to take care of you. And my doubles partner was also a pre-med major, and so it was kind of funny. I mean, we'd be on bus trips, and you're studying, and so one of us would hold up a flashlight for the other because we were getting so tired, and we'd wake up in the morning before matches and we'd grill each other and study together. And so, he's become my best friend for life. And a lot of the teammates, they were really supportive of us. And they said, look, we'll kind of look out for you. And then the professors, other than the organic chemistry teacher, the others were, I just sat down. You have to just sit down and explain to people, look, athletics is so important in my life. Maybe I'm not going to become a professional tennis player or a professional athlete, but I'm giving back to the school, and it's giving something that it's a skill that I think is going to be valuable for life. And I'll still do the work in your class. I'm not trying to cut corners or anything. And I think, again, when you advocate for yourself and, again, you surround yourself by people who are going to care for you and help you. I mean, that's sort of what I learned to do. And on top of that, be really disciplined.
And I think that's an important message for the athletes on the call, that self-advocacy. They have to step up and advocate for themselves, as well as develop that support network. That's a critical piece of navigating athletics and academics. And not being afraid to go up and just say, look, these things are equally important to me. And not taking no for an answer. I want to do both, and I expect you to help me do both, and just to prove to people that that's something you're very serious about.
Yeah, that's a great point. And when you look at other aspects of athletics, you have to really advocate for yourself. I mean, you have to make certain that you're eating properly, that you're training properly, and if you have friends that kind of want to tempt you and take you away from something when you have an important match or a game the next day, you have to be your own best advocate. And that combined with all the other things of, what does sport really involve? I mean, you have to learn how to fall down and pick yourself up, because we all fall down. You look at the number one athlete in the world, she's lost games, he's lost matches. And so, it's all those aspects of sport. If you don't advocate for yourself, you'll never become, as great as you potentially can be in sport. And then you take that and you do it for everything around you, whether it's, in your schoolwork or your social life, or, even your relationships, it's self-advocacy. And I think you combine that with self-compassion, to have that, ability to forgive yourself, because you are going to fall down, you're going to make mistakes. And then ultimately you take that, and I think that's how we can really give back to the world.
So did you transition directly from undergrad into medical school? Because something we've found with some of as we've talked to scholar athletes in our own medical school and as part of this initiative, we find that many, because of demands of their athletics, either take 1 or 2 gap years just to make up some of the academics to prepare for medical school. So what was your path to get into medical school?
Yeah, so I did go directly from my senior year of college and into medical school. Part of it, it was a bit financial. It was a complicated story. Well, I'll tell this story. I mean, because I think it is important, a little personal. But my junior year, there were some things that happened. There was one match where we were tied 4-4, and I lost the deciding match, and the coach sort of blamed it on me. And I said, well, coach, 4 other people lost their match. And then there were other things that happened. I actually ended up becoming clinically depressed, and I left the team, which was, really very, very difficult for me. But it's one of the reasons I'm so, involved in mental health things, because I was really clinically depressed, had no idea where to turn to, and I couldn't play tennis anymore. And when I shared this with my parents, they were, let's just put this, they weren't sympathetic, because they knew I was going to lose my scholarship, and they said I would have to figure out how to pay my senior year of college. So I did that. I worked and, got jobs, got loans, this and that, and really thought that I needed to go to medical school because I secured a loan right away, and I didn't want to start going more in debt. So again, it was part of all of that. One good part of the story is my senior year, after having not played for a year, I realized that I didn't have to play for my father or for coach. And again, it was being a self-advocate, and I loved the game, and I was able to figure out some of my own inner issues. And I asked coach if I could go back and play, and he didn't even blink. He said, yeah, in 3 conditions. 1, you agree not to quit. I said, well, coach, I'm here begging to play. I'm not going to quit. He said, 2, I give you no money. I said, coach, I'm not expecting money. I already took care of that. I have a loan. And he said, 3, you have a challenge match with the number 16 player tomorrow morning. And that was a Friday afternoon, and he was telling me that, and we were living off campus. And that night we were actually having a party at our campus house, and it was going to be a pretty big party. And I didn't get much sleep that night, and tried to talk coach out of that. He said, I'll see you tomorrow morning at 8. And I lost that challenge match, and I begged coach to give me another chance. And that year I actually worked my way up to number 1 on the team in singles and doubles, and tennis became mine for life. And I understood lessons about even more self-advocacy in terms of mental health. But that was sort of also a pressing issue for why I moved on right away, because I just didn't want to be more in debt, and had to I felt a pressure to stay on that pathway.
So thank you for sharing that with us. And I think it's important for students to understand that you're going to hit bumps in the road. And again, that resilience that we talk about and that we see in athletes, it comes across. But it's important for them to hear that. So thanks for sharing that with us. So you went to medical school where?
At University of Chicago.
Let's talk about that a little bit. The medical school path, how you decided to switch from psychiatry to neurology. How did that happen?
Well, when I was in medical school, so that gives you a little bit of my age here. So I was in medical school from 1978 to 1982. And that was at a time when there was what we call this psychopharmacologic revolution. We were almost treating the brain as if it was a beaker. You add a little bit of salt here, a little bit of pepper here, and or maybe a little Prozac over here, or Haldol over there, and it just didn't make sense to me. And At the same time, there was a revolution in understanding all of the brain pathways, because we were now for the first time getting brain imaging studies by way of CAT scans, later to evolve into what we call brain MRI studies. So it was really fascinating to think about the brain and as this really not just sort of this inert thing, but with these pathways that are really live, and even thinking about the pathways that are responsible for behavior and so forth. So that's what got me really into neurology, and I never looked back after that. Medical school was tough. My freshman year was particularly difficult. I remember anatomy. It didn't come naturally to me, and I have a little. I'm not really good at sort of spatial dimensional kind of thinking. I'm the kind of guy that, if I pull into a Macy's and I'm in one parking lot, and then I go out the other side of Macy's, I have no idea where the car is, and so I have to kind of recreate everything. So anatomy was tough. And I actually met with the dean, and, I wasn't 100% certain. I said, could I take maybe the second year off just to explore a little bit? And he made a deal with me. He said, why don't you get through second year? And if you still want to take a year off, I'll let you. And second year is when everything comes together. It's anatomy and physiology, and you start for the first time having interactions with patients, and something just clicked, and it was like, wow, this is what it's all about. It's not just dissecting a cadaver. It's putting that in relationship to physiology and looking at histopathology, and it all came together, and I never thought again of wanting to take another year off. But of course, one of the other things that happened is during my second year of medical school in December, so during the semester break, I got married. So rather young, but I met this woman from France, and she was living in France, and here I am in Chicago, and I said, well, maybe we can get married in a few years, and after things settle down. And but the idea of this transatlantic relationship, it just didn't make sense. So we got married, and the idea after getting married of me taking a year off didn't make a lot of sense either. So that's another little personal story in there. But yeah, the second year, everything came together. And then the third and fourth years is when you're really doing your clinical rotations. And it's just so unbelievably magical that, you think, in every rotation, you say, I'm going to be a pediatrician, or I'm going to be a cardiologist. Now I'm going to be an orthopedic surgeon. And, but then you end up integrating all of that into who you ultimately become as a physician.
Excellent. So how did the NCAA Chief Medical Officer piece come in? How did that come in to being in your path?
Well, a very important lesson for anyone considering a career in medicine or science, really anything. I actually, after I finished medical school, I did research for the first 6 years in neuro-oncology, so taking care of patients with brain tumors. One of the things that brought me into that is in medical school, my very, very best friend, to this day, the person, that other than my wife, who I was closest to in life, he died of a brain tumor, and that sort of pushed me in that direction, wanting to solve that riddle. Today, that riddle is still not solved. Senator McCain's, or President John McCain, he died of a brain tumor, and Senator Kennedy did, and President Biden's son, and it's still a very, very difficult disease to treat. And after 6 years, I sort of saw, this isn't making a lot of sense, and I wasn't sure I wanted to continue that pathway. And then out of the blue on a Friday night, I'll always remember, I just got back home from Blockbuster, so a lot of you may not know what Blockbuster Video is, but and we were ready to play it, and I got a call from someone at New York University. It was a colleague of mine saying, hey, Brian, we set up a neurology department at Hospital for Joint Diseases, and he was overseeing the epilepsy, and he said, could you come in and be the director of sports and clinical neurology? And I said, I don't know anything about sports neurology. I'm a neuro-oncologist doing research. And he said, yeah, but you're an athlete, you can figure out anything. And so that literally, it was a call out of the blue. I met with him several times, and I thought about it, and it was a brand new career, one that I hadn't really studied for, but I felt that with just when you really kind of ground yourself in a foundation, that You can explore anything, just like in sport. You can push yourself to the limit of anything, and then you can learn new techniques, new ways of getting better. I said, Jesus, sounds kind of interesting. So I started doing sports and general neurology, and with that got very involved in different sports organizations, the US Open Tennis Championships and the United States Olympic Committee, now the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. I was a ringside doc in New York, became involved in the New York Athletic Commission and a lot of other sports committees. And then ultimately, many years later, the NCAA, they started a position of chief medical officer. They had never even had that. The NCAA has been in existence since 1906, but they never had a position of chief medical officer. A couple of people called me and said, hey, Brian, would you consider applying for this? And I did. And, the interviews made a lot of sense. I saw that they were making a firm commitment to this. So that sort of happened out of the blue too, another phone call out of the blue, because at that time I was doing sports neurology part-time and had a busy practice. So, one important lesson is, we prepare ourselves, we have a career, but you're really preparing yourselves for life, because you never know what phone call you're going to get or what door is going to open. And again, going back to being an athlete, I think we're prepared for any possibility that might arise like that.
So we jumped over the USTA. We went to chief medical officer. Let's just talk about that as an experience. I'm sure that was it was different than it is now. I remember at one point being a professional athlete was one thing, but we had a lot of amateurs. Remember the AAU and all that. Can you talk about how that whole thing transpired and how that was influenced tennis?
What's another example of a phone call out of the blue? So here I am. I transitioned to Hospital for Joint Diseases. That was in 1991. And in 1991, one of the players at the US Open almost died of heat stroke. And what they realized on site is they had a lot of orthopedic surgeons, but there was no centralized game plan. Where was the ambulance? Where are the IVs? What do we do? Who's taking care of illnesses? And they did a gap analysis afterward, and they said, look, we really need a game plan. And I had done a lot of work already for the USTA, the US Tennis Association, which oversees the Open, and had written their drug policy. And so this was another call. It wasn't a blockbuster video call, but I remember it was a Friday afternoon conference, and I got called out of the conference. It was the executive director of the USTA. And he said, Brian, would you consider, beginning in 1992, being the chief medical officer of the US Open? His name was Marshall Happer. I said, Marshall, I'm a neurologist. That should be an orthopedic surgeon. He said, oh, no. We want someone who's going to come in, put a game plan in place. You surround yourself by people you want to surround yourself by, and that'll be that. And so I was chief medical officer, not just for the players, but for all of the spectators. So, I visited a lot of the sporting venues around the country, and then we created a game plan for how do we take care of disasters that might happen at the Open? How do we take care of a potential terrorist attack? We were thinking of that back then. And then how do we develop comprehensive care for the players? And, I loved it because, look, tennis gave me my life, and it was very interesting because you really got to work with the players. And I think the most important lesson I learned, more than any other lesson, is that these players are human beings. These athletes are human beings. And what makes them depressed is what makes other people depressed. You break up with your girlfriend or your boyfriend, or you have a financial hardship, or someone disses you, or something like that. And the other thing I realized is that, we cannot ever objectify athletes. We can't treat them like they're something other than human beings. And in fact, Reg, I actually fired 3 physicians during my 16 years at the US Open Tennis Championships because they asked an athlete for an autograph. Once you do that, you break that sacred bond between a physician and a human being who may happen to be an athlete, or maybe a homemaker, or maybe a physicist, or maybe, in some sort of industrial management. Everyone is a sacred human being. And these athletes, even though they may be on the world stage, so many of them are so young, and when they come to see you, they have the same essential emotion that anyone has when they go to see a doctor. They're afraid. They're afraid they have something wrong with them. And so I really learned that lesson, especially by taking care of athletes. So sport taught me another invaluable lesson. How do you really make certain that when you're with another patient, when you're with someone, that you're always operating from a place of dignity and sacredness and looking at their soulfulness and not how you can get something out of them, or, you know, have it on your, you know, in your office that, you know, you have an autographed picture of them.
So if you don't want to talk about this next question too deeply, I understand, but somewhere along the line, you ran across a fellow by the name of Arthur Ashe in your journey. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, sure. So takes me back to my roots in Detroit. So this was in the 60s, and there was this tournament at the Detroit Tennis Club, the Detroit Tennis and Squash Club. And my father and mother, and this was common back then, you know, the athletes didn't have a lot of money, they weren't making much in the tournaments. And so there was a community of people that would house the athletes, and every year Arthur Ashe would stay at our house. And he and my mother became really, really close. I mean, she was almost like a second mother to him. And I would be a ball boy at this tournament, so I was a ball boy for Arthur Ashe and a lot of other famous athletes, and I got to know him through that, and then later, actually, I came to know Jeannie Ashe, who was his wife and now his widow, over the years, and through her many activities of charitable work. But you know, just being with Arthur, and I was so impressionable back then, and he just seemed different. I mean, you talk about being a scholar and an athlete and having things in perspective, and also he was someone who had experienced firsthand, you know, a brutal racism, and you know, wasn't allowed to be in certain places, and he somehow persevered. And I didn't understand all of that, Reg, at that level back then, like I you know, have a better understanding now. But you kind of, at some level of your being, you understand it, and you know, we never want to worship people or hero worship, but on the other hand, he became one of my early heroes. You know, like, geez, maybe I could be someone like Arthur Ashe one day.
That's great, man. So he's one of my heroes as well, guys. He was an iconic person. So let's talk a little bit about your activities as Chief Medical Officer for NCAA. And here I want to just talk about the whole scholar athlete idea and how you see college athletes like yourself transitioning, what you're doing with the NCAA to move that forward. And then I want to talk also in that context about your activities around concussion protocols and things you're doing there.
Yeah, so, you know, at the NCAA, so the NCAA, so just so everyone knows, is 1,100 colleges and universities that have varsity athletics. There are other organizations that have varsity athletics as well. The NCAA is the largest. It's 500,000 athletes. It's a membership organization, so it's very different from, say, the NFL, which is top down. We're a representative democracy, and why things move slowly through the NCAA is because you need 1,100 schools to vote on it. I mean, Brian Hainline can't wake up tomorrow and say, this is what you're going to do for concussion or mental health. And, you know, it's sort of, as a full-time staff person who's here to serve the membership, it's this idea of lead serve. You help the membership make informed decisions. So one of the things we did was we set strategic priorities. You know, what are we concerned about for scholar athletes, for student athletes? Well, it's concussion, it's mental health, it's drug use, it's cardiac issues, it's sexual and interpersonal violence, it's overuse injuries. And so we developed programs around all of those. But, you know, Reg, I was 1 week on the job, and one important part of the student athletes is that every school has what's called a SAC, a Student Athlete Advisory Committee. And then every conference has SAC members that come from the various schools And then there's national SAC, National Student Athlete Advisory Committees. And they're all, you know, they vote on each other. So the national SAC comes from the conference SACs. And I remember I wasn't even 1 week on the job, and I met with the National Student Athlete Advisory Committees from Division I, Division II, and Division III. And they all said the same thing to me. I don't know if this was a conspiracy. I don't think so. I think they really, it was all independent thinking. They said, look, Dr. Hainline, we get concussion. Can you please make mental health your priority? And, you know, of course, that brought all these flashbacks to me about mental health and in my own life and how it was so pivotal as an athlete. And then I saw it as an incredible opportunity because, you know, we so often focus on the physical, but without mental health, it's, you know, where are we? And by the way, there was a great article about a week ago in the New York Times by Venus Williams. And she talked about how mental health for her was as important as her physical health, as her physical training. And so, you know, essentially what we've done as what I've done as Chief Medical Officer and in the Sport Science Institute is it's all collaboration. We collaborate with the really important medical and sports medicine organizations like, you know, the American Medical Society for Sports Medicine or the American Academy of Pediatrics. And we come up with best practices that we work out with the membership for all of these important areas of health. And that's essentially what we've been doing all along. And every time we have a meeting, you know, whether it's on mental health or cardiac or gambling or what have you, we always have representation from the Student Athlete Advisory Committee members. And they're a core component of how we're viewing, you know, what we need to do because, you know, they're the ones that are in the trenches experiencing it. So early on, I learned to listen to the student athletes. I developed an incredible collaborative relationship with National SAC. And it exists today. I mean, I really feel like we're joined at the hips and you know, we work side by side.
You know, talking about, you know, mental health, it's good to see that people are paying attention to it, but to your point, it hasn't received the attention that it should. And I'm glad to see that it's an important issue for you. What advice do you have for student athletes who may be having some mental health issues? Because on the one hand, there's this vulnerability and concern about disclosing a mental health issue and how that may be perceived by your coach and your teammates. But on the other hand, it's an important thing for them to address for their own well-being. So what kind of, from your experience, what kind of advice would you have for student athletes?
Well, again, it's about self-advocacy, but it goes beyond that for mental health, because I think you're right. You know, mental health is more in the closet even than LGBTQ plus issues. I mean, now you can be a national leader or a world leader and say, hey, I'm gay. But you can't be a national or world leader today and say, hey, you know, I suffer with bipolar and I had ECT and I'm on a stable dose of lithium. I'm ready to serve. It still has a stigma attached to it.
Yeah.
So through our mental health best practices, and then I was privileged to be involved with the International Olympic Committee in developing best practices. And that was prompted by a lot of really world famous athletes coming forward and say, hey, you know, I'm struggling. So we started gathering data. And so I'm going to present the data first and then talk about what the athletes and even parents should do. We know now that if you suffer with certain mental health symptoms and disorders, it's a predictor of injury, any kind of injury, and it's a predictor of poor performance. We know that if you're injured and post-injury, as you're rehabbing, if you develop depression or anxiety, that impedes your recovery, including after surgery, including even if you've had biomechanically perfect reconstructive surgery. You develop clinical depression post-operatively, you will not have the same recovery. You will not have the same functionality afterward. And so mental health and performance, mental health and physical health, they really operate bi-directionally, meaning you can't tell which comes first, which comes second. They always influence one another. We know that if you identify yourself as an athlete and not as a soulful human being, you suddenly are transitioning out of sport because of an injury, you got cut, something else happens, that you're at high risk for developing mental health symptoms and disorders. So that's just some of the data background. One of the most important things we've tried to do is we've educated coaches and parents and said, look, mental health and physical health, you can't separate them, but we have to take the stigma away from mental health care seeking. In fact, mental health care should be as available as seeking care for a sprained ankle.
Yeah.
That's how easy it should be. And then, earlier I was talking about surrounding yourself by people that care for you, that love you. Your friends, you should be able to talk with your friends, and if you have hidden dark thoughts, speak with your friends about it, and speak with your parents about it, and don't be afraid to seek professional help. And for parents, I can't stress enough that if we don't address when someone is suffering with mental health symptoms and disorders, or for a coach, and if we just say, well, just tough it out or just suck it up, it doesn't work. It will always come back to haunt you. And I was speaking at a conference the other day, and we were talking about the long-term athlete development model and how you really train, in multi-sport as a young child. You learn athleticism, the ABCs of athleticism: agility, balance, coordination, speed, stamina, strength. But all of that is based on something called fundamentals. And fun is capital F-U-N. If you aren't having fun, if you don't have enjoyment, chances are you're going to burn out. And that's a very, very important, to learn how to have fun. And so, I'll end with this. One of the papers that we wrote, there's actually unequivocal evidence that one of the most important things a coach can teach an athlete is self-compassion. And so when we have that, and when we understand that it's okay not to be okay, to seek help, and we just take away the stigma and just think of it, you wouldn't dare not seeking help if you had really bad back pain, or if you had an ankle injury or shoulder injury. It's the same thing if you are feeling confused, or worse yet, if you're having darker thoughts inside. And at some point or another, everyone's had dark thoughts, sometimes even thinking, is life worth it? But if they're going beyond that, it's really, really critical to seek help. And that's what's going to make you a better human being and a better athlete.
Excellent. Thank you. So I could talk to you for quite some time, but we have some folks who may have some questions. So Anthony, do we have any questions in the chat? I mean, in the Q&A?
So far, nobody has put anything in the chat. Please feel free to put anything in the Q&A section, and we will try to answer your questions if you have any.
And you only have 10 minutes. We're not going to keep Dr. Hainline too long. He's been very generous with his time. So we have 10 minutes to get your questions. So let's talk a little bit about this Athletes in Medicine and Science initiative that we've been working on for the last several years. And you've been a very, very strong advocate there. Obviously based upon your own experience. But let's talk about where you see this going, and how you think we should best position ourselves to encourage athletes across the spectrum to consider these careers, science and health careers.
Yeah, so I was approached a few years ago by Dr. Roy Wilson, and he's the president of Wayne State University in Detroit. And he just presented to me this startling statistic that there were more Black male doctors in medical school in the 1970s than there are today. And that's a public health crisis, because if a Black man sees a white male physician, his compliance rate may be as low as 30%. Yet if he sees someone that he identifies with more easily, if he sees another Black male physician, his compliance rate is following the recommended directions can be as high as 70 or 80%. And I was, I should have known that statistic, and I didn't. And then we looked at there are a large number of Black athletes at the NCAA, disproportionately in some of the higher end athletic schools in basketball and football. and they're not necessarily encouraged to go into science or related subjects, and often they've been avoiding that even in high school, which gets to your incredible SWAG program, Reg. I mean, that people think that if you're an athlete, well, you can't go into science or technology or engineering or math. Well, yeah, sure you can. You can go into anything, and so it's at an early age giving them that possibility. But then in college, we are started putting together pilot programs working with the Association of American Medical Colleges and the National Institutes of Health, where programs would work and encourage athletes, especially athletes of color, to follow a pathway into medicine or other aspects of science. And so, we had a big roadblock with COVID, as we had a lot of roadblocks with COVID. But now we're back up and running, and so really happy to be part of that, and hope that takes us somewhere exciting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wasn't a college athlete. I worked. That's how I spent my spare time when I was in college. So I've been learning a lot about this whole athletic journey. Even though my sons played sports, they weren't college athletes at all. They focus on academics. So it's just an interesting set of challenges trying to convince those individuals, athletes, as well as coaches, that they need to encourage kids, especially young Black males, to pursue academics as seriously as they pursue athletics. And that's really one of the goals of the SWAG initiative is to have that dual message. When you've talked to coaches, NCAA coaches, what has been your experience when you speak to folks about this initiative?
Well, there's broad acceptance, generally speaking. It gets a little tougher when you get into, what you see on television for the NCAA athletics represents about 5% of the NCAA. 5%. So when you're watching an Alabama football game, or you're watching Ohio State or what have you, that's a real minority of the NCAA, and it's a little bit tougher in those schools. But again, that's in the 95% of the NCAA. I think there's a much more open acceptance to this, but we aren't forgetting the 5% either. Okay, great.
And the other piece of that we can't forget about is the role of parents. Those parents are they're the first influencers. They're the first ones to get kids involved in sports. And so having parents aware of their role and helping their children make decisions, we think is also very important in this.
Yeah, and when you look at the NCAA statistics, about 1% of NCAA student athletes go on to play professional sports. The other 99% go on to be professionals. And so, I think not everyone's going to be a professional. It's unrealistic to think that one is going to, and if it works out, fine. But you can still compete at the highest level and be a scholar. And I think that's the most important lesson we have to instill in our athletes from a very young age.
Great. I see a question in the Q&A. Anthony, you want to read the question?
It says, how early should we realistically encourage Black student athletes to consider medical professions?
I probably wouldn't do it before age 2. No, I think it's like with anything. You want to be very well grounded as you're growing up. So when so I'm going to get to tennis. When Emma Raducanu, who won the women's tennis championships, she played all sports. Didn't start playing tennis really seriously till age 12 or so. So you want to have a solid foundation in all aspects of athletics and a solid foundation in multi-sport. And it's really when you're around puberty, 12, 13, where you start becoming interested in something. And if you're grounded in science and in literature and in math and in poetry, you can choose from anything. And so I don't think it's good to push early specialization in sport or early specialization in academics before age 12 or 13. Get the foundation, and then the ability to choose is going to come from a great foundation. So I view the academic choice and the sport choice in a very, very similar manner.
Okay, thank you. Anthony, it's on you. Is there more, another question, second question?
The next question is, are there any signs that youth coaches can pick up on that indicates that the athlete is experiencing, that can help the coach better understand what the student is going through, especially so that they don't push too hard?
Yeah, so, the first is, that coaches should just be open-minded to the idea that, look, people are people, and everyone can be down. And so what you're really looking for is if someone is all of a sudden exhibiting behavior that's uncharacteristic. So they're suddenly withdrawing from the group. They're not talking. Their performance has really gone off. They're missing practices, or they're showing up really late, making excuses, or they're, you see them becoming, emotionally volatile, that they'll cry all of a sudden, or get withdrawn. These are all warning signs, and it's not the coach's job to be managing this, but the coach is an important part of validating and just saying, hey, I'm here. Is anything going on? But we're hoping to widely circulate. This came out of the International Olympic Committee, a sports mental health recognition tool. It's a one-pager, and it's like a red light, yellow light, green light, that any non-trained individual stakeholder in sport can look at. And there are certain when you have a red light, you actually don't leave that person's side until they have professional help. So that's if someone's all of a sudden psychotic, or they're actively suicidal, something like that. So most of it's just, having a willingness to be observed, and to be empathetic, and to know that it's not your job to treat, but to maybe give a handoff and be a bridge to something that can be helpful.
Thank you. The next question we have is, what advice do you have for student athletes who experience pushback from coaches and athletic directors when it comes to pursuing tougher classes because of how difficult it is to take these classes with such intense practice schedule?
Yes, and I think that's where it gets to two things. One is, especially at the high school level, I think parents have to be a very strong advocate as well. And sometimes it's I know I've done this in many occasions. I actually rehearse what I'm going to say to someone. I always rehearse before I give a big talk, but if I'm going to have an important conversation or a confrontational conversation, I actually practice it in front of a mirror. And it gets back to what we talked about earlier. You just must learn to be your own best advocate, and to say, look, coach, let me try it, because I know I can do both. And I think actually I'll be a better athlete if I'm able to pursue the scholarly activities that give me pleasure in life.
Thank you. Currently don't have any other questions in the chat.
Okay, and that's timing. So it's 7 o'clock. Dr. Hainline, you've been very, very generous with your time. You've definitely given us a game plan to think about, and we appreciate you sharing your path and your various experiences in sports with us. So thank you again. And this is brings this particular series to a conclusion. Again, we thank you all for joining the game plan series. Our motto is, we're looking for athletes with swag. So if you're an athlete out there and you think you have some swag, look us up and get involved in this initiative. Until our next session, thank you and have a good evening. Thank you, Brian. Take care, man.
Thanks, Reggie, too. All right.